2010 was a big year for my fellow God of War fans. With the conclusion of the main trilogy releasing in March, many fans were left to ponder what would be next for the Ghost of Sparta. Where do you go from here? Well, we didn't have to wait long to get our answer with the announcement and release of God of War Ghost of Sparta in November for the PlayStation Portable. I was unbelievably hyped to get my hands on Ghost of Sparta back in the day, as I love Chains of Olympus, and well, more God of War wasn't a bad thing. I still remember getting it for Christmas, popping it in my PSP, smashing it out that day, and absolutely loved it. As a fan of Chains of Olympus, Ghost of Sparta was just a great improvement on the handheld God of War formula, whilst adding an interesting bit of backstory to Kratos. But I didn't play this one as much as I replayed Chains of Olympus for some reason, and in all honesty, I can't remember too much about God of War Ghost of Sparta today. This always gets me excited though when revisiting games because it's a chance to fully re-experience a game, and if it's good, great, and if not, well, probably explains why I forgot about it. So now that I've finished revisiting God of War Ghost of Sparta, the question is, how well does the game hold up today, and is it worth your time revisiting or playing for the first time? Let's find out. Just quickly, before we begin, this is now my 5th video on the God of War series so far, so if you've just found the channel, I recommend catching up on this series of retrospectives. Click the link in the top right hand corner or in the description below for the playlist, and what the hell, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The story for Ghost of Sparta is set after the events of the original God of War, but before God of War 2. Kratos has taken Ares' place as the God of War, but although he was now amongst the Olympians, he was still haunted by visions of his mortal life. These are not the visions we have become accustomed to though, this time centering around Kratos' childhood. Now the story here does revolve around these visions much like in the original God of War as you progressively learn more and more information, so for the sake of the synopsis, let's get it all out there now. Through a series of flashbacks we learn that an oracle foretold the fall of Olympus, but not at the hands of the Titans, and instead by a mortal marked warrior. Zeus and Ares believed this marked warrior to be Kratos' brother, Deimos, due to his odd birthmarks. Ares seized a village in Sparta with Athena during a childhood training session between Kratos and Deimos, and the two gods kidnap Deimos. Kratos attempts to stop them but is brushed aside by Ares, leaving him with a nice scar, but before Ares can kill Kratos, Athena steps in telling Ares they just came for the marked warrior, pleading to not take the other boy's life. The two gods leave with Deimos, taking him to the domain of death, which sees Deimos tortured and imprisoned by the god of death, Thanatos. In honor of his sibling, Kratos marked himself with his iconic red tattoos identical to that of his presumed dead brother. These visions have haunted Kratos for years, and so he decides against Athena's wishes to begin to explore his past and travels to the Temple of Poseidon, located in the city of Atlantis. A sea monster known as Scylla attacks and destroys Kratos' ship off the coast of Atlantis before he managed to drive the monster off, and through a series of battles throughout Atlantis, finally slay the beast. Kratos reaches the Temple of Poseidon where he finds his mother Callisto, who after years of secrecy attempts to reveal his father's identity, before suddenly transforming into a hideous monster. Kratos is forced to fight his mother, and before she dies, thanks him and urges Kratos to seek out Deimos in Sparta. Before we leave Atlantis, Kratos meets and frees the Titan Thera, which ends up causing Atlantis to sink. Whilst escaping the city's destruction, Kratos encounters the Gravedigger, who warns the Spartan of the dangers of alienating the gods. Whilst travelling through the Aronia Pass, Kratos meets and ultimately slays Thanatos' daughter, Erinys, and arrives in Sparta, where he is lauded by the people. On our way to the Temple of Ares, we witness a group of Spartans led by the last Spartan from God of War 2, tearing down a statue of Ares in order to erect one of Kratos. Whilst in the jails of Sparta, Kratos chases down a dissenter loyal to Ares who attempts to kill Kratos by releasing the Piraeus lion. Of course, this doesn't go well for the dissenter as Kratos kills both the lion and, after the most serial killer walk ever, the dissenter as well. Once Kratos reaches the Temple of Ares, he encounters the spirit of his child self, where he learns that he must now return to the sunken city of Atlantis and find the domain of death. Before we leave, the last Spartan hands Kratos his former weapons used during Kratos' time as captain of the Spartan army, the arms of Sparta, and we return to the sunken Atlantis. Poseidon berates Kratos for sinking his beloved city, and we enter the domain of death. Kratos finds and frees his imprisoned brother, but Deimos is less than thankful. Enraged, Kratos vowed to rescue him sooner, vowing to never forgive him. Deimos attacks and overpowers Kratos, but Thanatos intervenes and takes Deimos to the site where Kratos attempted suicide. Kratos saves Deimos from falling to his death, and now grateful, the two brothers team up to take out Thanatos. It's at this point when Thanatos realizes that Ares had chosen the wrong brother all those years ago, and instead, as we all know, it should have been Kratos. Thanatos kills Deimos in battle, but is soon after destroyed by Kratos. Kratos mourns the loss of his brother, remarking that he is finally free, and places Deimos in his grave dug by the gravedigger. Athena begs for forgiveness, offering Kratos a chance at full godhood, but Kratos ignores her and returns to Olympus, promising that the gods will pay for this. The game fades to black with Athena whispering, "Forgive me, brother," and a post-credit scene shows the gravedigger placing Callisto in a grave beside Deimos, with a third grave still to be filled, as he states, "Now only one remains." And that's the story for Ghost of Sparta. Immediately, this story comes across as a big improvement over the one told in Chains of Olympus. It feels like Ready at Dawn learned a lot more about telling a story in a portable platform, because where Chains of Olympus felt like they had to cut short a potentially epic story, here in Ghost of Sparta the story is a lot more simple. It doesn't feel cut short, and because of that the story obviously feels more complete. I really enjoyed the story presented here despite some issues I'll touch on in a minute. I love learning more about Kratos' past and why he has become the man we experience today, and simultaneously seeing a kinder or softer side to the Ghost of Sparta amongst all the death and destruction. Moments like when Kratos is comforting the injured Spartan who encounters Erinus shows just how much he cares for his people. As with all that has gone on in Kratos' life, the Spartan army is really his only remaining family. When Kratos finally finds Deimos, he allows him the chance of killing him, as he will not slay another family member and would rather die, and that is further shown when Kratos is carrying his fallen brother's body, as despite his best efforts, he ultimately failed to save his brother, leaving him all alone in this world. These moments add further depth to Kratos that personally I really appreciate, and Ghost of Sparta, if nothing else, just adds further explanation and backstory behind his fuel for vengeance. It's not all niceties though, and when Kratos wants to, he is straight up psychotic, almost as if the power is beginning to go to his head. The way he deals with the Dissenter or King Midas isn't overly graphic, but very eerie. More so than usual, to a point where it doesn't feel like vengeance and more so a power fantasy. As per usual, the myths behind the story and how the developers interpret them into this universe is always going to grab my attention. And to see lesser known gods and locations amongst the long awaited introductions is great stuff as always. Gods like Thanatos, whilst I have my issues with in terms of the story, are great to see here as the personification of death, which many would assume to be Hades, and his own realm in the domain of death is very dark and depressing, like it should be, further showing the god's displeasure through Poseidon's interaction and disdain for Kratos after sinking Atlantis, the tale of King Midas, and just how depressing his depiction in Ghost of Sparta is amazing. Having Kratos be responsible for sinking Atlantis is a great touch, the Piraeus lion being a landmark in reality and turning it into a real creature and boss is interesting, along with including real Greek cities and locales like Sparta, Heraklion, the island of Crete, the Methana volcano, and the mounts of Aronia and Laconia are all great inclusions that ground this world into reality, and that's something I can always appreciate. It's not all sunshines and rainbows though, as unfortunately there are still some aspects to this story that simply don't get explained or make sense. For example, Ares, Zeus, and Thanatos not simply killing Deimos originally. Zeus says at the end, just one remains, like this was the plan all along, but if they wanted Deimos dead, why not have done that in the first place? If we're in the domain of death, shouldn't Hades' realm be close enough that Kratos could go there to get Deimos back after death? How come Thanatos saves Kratos from Deimos? And then, why does he leave Deimos dangling instead of again just killing him right there? Why does Deimos have weapons, and Deimos despising Kratos is understandable. So when he does a 180 so quickly and joins forces with Kratos, it's odd to say the least. There's just a lot of questions I was left with once the game was all said and done that despite believing this to be an improvement over Chains of Olympus, it does still feel less complete than I'd like. I mean, Thanatos in particular does feel like this big bad guy for the sake of it, instead of a true villain. Overall, despite these issues again, in the moment, this is all a good time to experience. I do recommend not thinking about all of this too much though, because the story can unravel itself. I still think the story adds enough to Kratos' past and backstory, adds interesting Greek myths into the mix, and the journey to Death's domain is filled with great moments. It's an improved story in my opinion over Chains of Olympus, but it's good rather than great, which it definitely had the potential to be. When you're dealing with such a short runtime though of just under 5 hours, I think simple was the way to go, and if nothing else, adding further fuel to Kratos' vengeance is enough to grab my attention from beginning to end. It still amazes me how well Ready at Dawn managed to emulate the console God of War experience onto a portable device, and Ghost of Sparta just improves on the foundation established in Chains of Olympus, except where that game felt much more like the original game, here Ghost of Sparta plays more like God of War 2, which I shouldn't have to tell you is already a great improvement. So let's just jump straight into it, and as always we need to start with the meat and potatoes of the series, the combat. The combat here in Ghost of Sparta feels right at home with the rest of the series, but by this stage we all know how the core of God of War's combat works, so let's talk the new additions, which I'll be honest isn't a whole lot. We have the tried and true Blades of Chaos or Athena, the new spear and shield combo with the arms of Sparta, Thera's Bane which inflames the blades of Athena in regards to weapons, and the Eye of Atlantis, Scourge of Aranus, and Horn of Boreas in terms of magic. There is no rage meter this time around for some reason, but Thera's Bane somewhat replaces it, so not too big a loss. Immediately it doesn't sound like a lot of options, and well, it isn't. In all honesty, Ghost of Sparta's combat is lacking a bit of variety this time around, especially considering the lack of balance between the weapons and abilities. For instance, as much as I love the fact that they finally brought in the iconic Spartan shield and spear, they simply aren't as useful as the blades. With the new addition of Thera's Bane, along with enemies only able to be damaged by the flame attack, it's just more convenient and effective to have the blades ready to go. Don't get me wrong, the arms have their uses, with the ranged attack and ability to block and attack simultaneously, but they just don't have the variety of combos or damage output like that of the blades. And I think the developers even acknowledged this by giving the arms to Deimos in the final fight, knowing the player wouldn't mind losing them. Same goes for the magic ability Horn of Boreas, as whilst again it has its uses with freezing enemies, it's just for too short a time, leaving the player to go to the Eye of Atlantis' shock charge and the incredibly useful Scourge of Eris that floats around the combat arena, hurting enemies and giving health back to the player. The Eye and Scourge are just a more worthwhile use of your magic bar, leaving the Horn rarely used, at least personally. You also have in this portable medium less variety in terms of enemies as well, which I don't believe I touched on in Chains of Olympus, but that can lead to the combat feeling rather samey as well. After saying all of that though, I'm not saying I didn't enjoy myself with the combat this time around, because I still had a lot of fun for many of the same reasons I've stated throughout the series. The game still has a good flow to it, the blades feel great as always to whip around and cause a beautiful chaos dance with. The Scourge of Eris is a top tier magic ability out of the whole series. The Eye of Atlantis is a worthwhile competitor to the Scourge, and since you get it first, it has time to level up and properly compete at a max electric power. Thera's Bane is a great new mechanic, allowing for more frequent damage buffs than the rage abilities, and the arms are a super unique weapon that, whilst not the best competitor, are something new for the series, which is appreciated. It all still feels like a good God of War combat experience, and it's important not to forget this isn't the first game in the series to have irrelevant feeling options. Overall, the combat may not seem like it, as I've gone over the good to the combat of this series over and over at this point, but the tweaks, changes, and additions such as the God of War 2-like combat is a sizable improvement over the Chains of Olympus experience, which was pretty good to begin with. On the nitpickier side, the camera is still somewhat a problem. They didn't quite nail the tracking for it, but for the most part it isn't too big an issue. The bosses are what this series is known for though, and here in Ghost of Sparta they're a pretty good time with 6 bosses overall, and are much more evenly spaced out, which is an improvement from Chains of Olympus. They aren't the most challenging battles, I must say, but still good fun. As is tradition, the game begins with a boss fight, this time around with Scylla, which in terms of the actual boss fight plays very similarly to the Hydra battle and looks a little too close to the Basilisk. Scylla and Kratos' mother Callisto both act in very much a tutorial fashion, so they are just battles mainly focused on brushing out the cobwebs or teaching new players the controls, but in their own ways. The Scylla fight is where you're getting used to the mechanics with a big target to practice on, whereas Callisto is more similar to the one-on-one battles or fights against enemies like the Cyclops, so it's a nice way to ease the player into using dodge rolls, parries, and finding openings to attack. I enjoyed both fights personally. The Scylla battle is this lengthy tango with great set pieces to accompany it, and it always feels good taking out these behemoth bosses, although maybe a little too similar to previous battles in the series. And Callisto hits with a good amount of force and can stun you if you aren't careful, but overall basic enough in terms of attacks to memorize and avoid, whilst capitalizing on your openings. Next up we have the battle against Thanatos' daughter Eris, which is Ghost of Sparta's first proper boss battle. Eris is probably the most challenging boss in the game, which isn't saying too much, but because we don't have access to the Scourge of Eris yet, for obvious reasons, this fight isn't as much of a cakewalk. Eris is quick, she darts around the arena, can drag Kratos into a void that stun locks us, fires quick projectiles, and summons birds to act as a brief distraction from her attacks. After this first phase, Eris transforms into a giant bird, which is a great set piece, whilst not the most gameplay oriented, and a free falling segment, which again, not too much to do, but still a great set piece. Eris is probably my favourite fight in the game because again we don't have all our overpowered tools yet. She has various attacks, poses a real threat which makes for an engaging battle that stands out amongst the rest, and it all culminates into one hell of a set piece. Next is the Piraeus Lion, which doesn't really feel like a boss if I'm honest, as it seems like a reskin of another enemy doesn't take too long to slay, and doesn't have too many attacks to worry about. This boss is after you unlock the Scourge of Erinnys though, and again the ability is just too good. Not an unenjoyable battle, but not too memorable unfortunately. After this we have our battle with Deimos, which in concept is a dope idea, having an opponent who should in theory be as tough as Kratos. That isn't how it pans out though, as again the Scourge does work, his attack tells are a little too obvious, and despite owning him in the fight, he wins, which just makes it all feel a little for nothing. Not a terrible battle and an interesting concept, but the ability balance does mark this fight a little bit. Lastly, we have our fight with Thanatos, which we take on with the help of Deimos. This fight is really enjoyable and honestly a lot of fun. Thanatos has quite the arsenal of attacks at his disposal, a lot of health, and throughout the fight you'll need the help of Deimos or vice versa. His larger form isn't as much of a threat, but he does fire a projectile at lightning speed that is a tricky attack to parry. This is a great final fight though, as you have a lot to worry about. The Scourge of Erinnys isn't as useful as in other battles, as Thanatos can escape its stun lock. His attacks are various and hard to nail down by wind-ups, and having to take into account Deimos' well-being and location in the fight makes for a great engaging battle. On the whole, the bosses are a good bit of fun. They aren't all winners, but they are all enjoyable despite the lack in challenges for most. Highlights again go to Thanatos and Erinnys personally, as they are more challenging battles of the game, which personally I enjoy more. But the set piece and spectacle of Scylla is also worth remembering, and these bosses feel like they are worth remembering amongst the series, which for a portable entry is a hell of an accomplishment. Much like Chains of Olympus, the other components that make up the God of War formula aren't as present here in Ghost of Sparta as that of the console games, but this time around they definitely tried to include more platforming than before. Unfortunately, they added the wrong sort of platforming, with planks making a return despite no challenge or distraction, wall fights, and chain combat. This feels like the wrong answer to Chains of Olympus' heavy combat focus, and I understand they wanted Ghost of Sparta to play more like God of War 2. Taking moments straight from it, even the coolest platforming moment in the game. But they brought back mechanics that hadn't aged well and didn't improve them. The platforming overall isn't bad, but the decision to bring back these mechanics did leave me scratching my head. The puzzles are also seemingly non-existent. I mean, I really can't think of any. Overall, I know I've been a little more negative than usual in regards to Ghost of Sparta's gameplay, but honestly, that's only because a lot of the positives I would have said, well, I've already gone over them in previous videos. The combat is still a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed messing around with the new abilities and trying out the iconic arms of Sparta. The bosses, whilst not overly challenging, are still great to experience and deliver that power fantasy. But the platforming inclusions are odd and the lack of puzzles is strange, and I'd just have liked to have had more options and variety inserted into the combat here, with balancing in regards to the weapons and abilities. On the whole though, I did have a great time playing Ghost of Sparta, and whilst it may have backstepped in some aspects from Chains of Olympus, as a whole it was a great improvement. So, was God of War Ghost of Sparta worth remembering? Overall, I'd say yes, but it's by no means perfect. The story is a great insight into Kratos' backstory, further fleshing out the Ghost of Sparta, but some areas in the story needed more time or explanation to feel more satisfying. The gameplay feels more like God of War 2 this time around, which is a net positive, and it's still a blast to play with some great boss fights and set pieces along the way. It just isn't as balanced as I would have liked, and the lack of variety can lead to a feeling of repetition, which shouldn't be happening in a less than 5-hour game. Along with odd re-inclusions in the platforming and the exclusion of puzzles that does hurt the flow of the game a tad. But as a whole, it does learn a lot from Chains of Olympus and enhances the God of War portable experience. Again, these portable entries may not be the best games in the series, but they are great portable games that Ready at Dawn pulled off incredibly well. And I don't see why any God of War fan wouldn't enjoy either game, because I had a great time with Ghost of Sparta even after all these years. Thank you all so much for watching. I really did enjoy my time revisiting God of War Ghost of Sparta, and I hope you enjoyed revisiting the game with me. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave it a like because it helps let me know that you enjoyed yourself. Comment below your thoughts on God of War Ghost of Sparta or the series in general, as well as any suggestions for games you want to see covered in the future. If you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe, go give my socials a follow if you fancy, @MayorHairBear. And I'll catch you all in the next video.